Chad, a landlocked country in Central Africa, had long been an enigma to the world. Its vast deserts, rolling plains, and rugged terrain were often overshadowed by its ongoing internal struggles. The world knew Chad primarily for its battles, with armed rebel groups, its fight for stability, and the challenges posed by its weak infrastructure. But despite the difficulties, Chad remained relatively quiet in the larger scheme of international politics. It wasn't often in the global spotlight, and its political influence seemed minimal compared to the other, more powerful African nations. However, in recent years a change had begun to stir under the surface, a change that no one was quite prepared for. The country's political landscape had always been a complex one. Its leaders had been engaged in constant struggles to maintain control amidst rebellion, corruption, and economic challenges. The government had often turned to military solutions to maintain order, leaving little room for development or progress. But despite all this, there was one thing that set Chad apart: the country's geostrategic importance. Sitting at the crossroads of Central Africa, Chad's location was key to the wider region, especially in the fight against terrorism, as several militant groups had taken root in neighboring countries. Its proximity to Libya, Sudan, and the Sahel region made Chad a crucial player in the fight against extremism and instability. It was in this context that the United States started to take a keen interest in Chad. Over the years, as violent extremist organizations began to gain more ground in Africa, Chad became an important ally in the U.S. military's fight against terrorism. Chad's government, though not perfect by any means, had proven itself a reliable partner in counter-terrorism efforts, particularly in the vast and dangerous regions of the Sahel. The U.S. military set up bases in Chad, using it as a staging ground for operations across Africa. This close relationship, based on shared goals of security and stability, seemed unbreakable at the time. Yet behind the scenes, not everyone in Chad was happy with the influence the U.S. had gained in their country. While many recognized the importance of having strong military ties to the U.S., there was a growing sense of unease about how much control the American presence had over the country. Some saw it as a reminder of Chad's dependence on outside powers, and others resented the constant interference in their national affairs. A certain segment of the population felt that the country should have more freedom to make its own decisions, free from foreign influence, particularly from the West. In 2018, a major turning point occurred. President Idris Deby, who had ruled Chad since 1990, found himself in a difficult position. His leadership was increasingly challenged by internal political struggles and external pressures. Despite the support from the West, including the U.S., there was no denying that Chad was facing growing internal tensions. The country was beset by corruption, a lack of resources, and a population that was becoming restless with the status quo. Rebellions continued to break out in the east, while widespread poverty and unemployment lingered across the country. The average Chadian struggled to see the benefits of the foreign support that was flowing in from the U.S. and other Western countries. But the U.S. had not been blind to these internal struggles. In fact, the country's human rights record had become a point of concern for Washington. Despite the cooperation in the fight against terrorism, the U.S. had grown increasingly critical of Chad's human rights abuses. Reports of government crackdowns on dissent, limitations on freedom of expression, and restrictions on political opposition were surfacing, and the United States could no longer ignore them. In 2017, the U.S. imposed sanctions on Chad, freezing the assets of several top government officials and restricting travel. This move was part of a broader effort by the U.S. to ensure that its allies upheld certain standards of governance and human rights. This action by the U.S. stung. It was a clear signal that Chad's partnership with the United States was not as secure as it once seemed. The sanctions sent a strong message, one that challenged Chad's leadership. Idris Deby, already facing growing internal dissent, was now caught between the pressure from the West and the rising nationalist sentiment at home. This was a turning point. Some believed that the government would buckle under pressure from the U.S. and make concessions. Others saw it as a time for Chad to redefine its future, free from the restrictions placed upon it by outside powers. For Deby, the challenge was personal. He had been in power for decades, and much of his leadership had been defined by his ability to navigate both internal instability and the pressure from foreign governments. His government had maintained a delicate balance of relationships, but the increasing strain from the U.S. sanctions created a new level of difficulty. There was now a growing belief among some of his key advisors that Chad needed to break free from its reliance on Western powers, especially the United States. It was in this charged atmosphere of tension that the country's leadership began to think about a bold new direction. While they had relied heavily on foreign aid and military support in the past, the idea of becoming more independent began to take root. Chad was, after all, a proud country with a rich history. Why should it continue to rely on the U.S. for military and economic support when it could, in theory, chart its own course? The idea of asserting Chad's independence on the global stage started to gather momentum. Discussions behind closed doors among Chad's leadership started to focus on how they could pivot away from the United States. They began to explore alternative partnerships, particularly with other African nations, and sought ways to strengthen ties with countries that had been critical of U.S. involvement in the region. As the government started to position itself for a major shift, the sense of anticipation grew. Would this be the moment that Chad, traditionally seen as a follower in global politics, would surprise the world? As these plans began to unfold, the international community remained largely unaware of the storm brewing. To the outside world, Chad was still a small, struggling country with a heavy dependence on foreign assistance. However, those in Chad's corridors of power knew that things were about to change. The world would soon find out just how far Chad was willing to go to secure its future. In the meantime, the U.S. was still focused on its counter-terrorism efforts, and the presence of American forces in Chad remained steady. But there were signs of growing unease. The political climate in Chad was shifting, and everyone knew that something was brewing behind the scenes. In a region as volatile as Africa, with countless players involved, change was often sudden and unpredictable. And so, as the months went by, the tension continued to mount, setting the stage for a move that would change Chad's place in the world forever. The growing tension between Chad and the United States had not gone unnoticed. Behind the scenes, political leaders in Chad were having conversations that would soon alter the country's future. As President Idris Deby sat in his office late at night, he was confronted with a difficult decision. The U.S. sanctions had sent shockwaves through his government, and the pressure was mounting. Chad had long relied on the United States for military support, intelligence sharing, and financial aid. The American military presence in Chad had played a pivotal role in the country's fight against terrorism, particularly in the vast and unpredictable Sahara and Sahel regions. But now, with sanctions in place, the situation had taken a different turn. For years, Deby had skillfully navigated the complex political environment of both Chad and the international stage. He had managed to balance relations with powerful countries like the United States while still maintaining control over his government. However, the growing unrest in his country made it clear that Chad could not continue down the same path indefinitely. People were becoming more and more frustrated with the state of the nation. Unemployment was high, poverty was widespread, and the wealth of the country remained largely concentrated in the hands of a few powerful elites. Many of the promises of stability and progress had not been fulfilled, and people began to question the leadership that had been in place for nearly 3 decades. There were protests in the streets, especially in the capital, N'Djamena. Citizens were demanding better living conditions, more opportunities, and, most importantly, a government that would prioritize the welfare of its people. Chad's natural resources, including oil and uranium, were some of the most valuable in Africa, but the people hardly saw any benefit from these riches. The sense of inequality was palpable, and it was becoming impossible for the government to ignore. While Chad had been focusing on maintaining stability with the help of foreign allies, the government had done little to address the needs of its own people. Internally, there was also growing pressure from political opponents who had been sidelined for years. These opposition leaders began to organize more openly, criticizing the government for its failure to deliver on promises and its reliance on foreign powers. The political situation was heating up, and Deby was beginning to realize that maintaining the status quo was no longer a sustainable option. A change was necessary, but what kind of change? And who could the country trust to guide it through this storm? At the same time, the United States had continued to push Chad on its human rights record, increasing its demands for political reform. President Deby had always been able to navigate the tricky balance between meeting Western expectations and maintaining his own grip on power. But the recent sanctions added a new layer of complexity. The U.S. government was no longer content to simply offer aid. It wanted Chad to demonstrate tangible improvements in governance and the treatment of its people. These demands felt like an ultimatum, and for Deby the pressure was starting to build. If Chad continued to rely on the U.S. for military aid and financial support, it would have to comply with the conditions set by Washington. On the other hand, if Chad were to distance itself from the U.S. and explore other paths, it would lose the protection and resources the U.S. provided. The more Deby thought about it, the more he realized that this moment could define his legacy. Chad had long been dependent on outside powers, whether it was the U.S., France, or neighboring countries. Yet, time and time again, the country had found itself in difficult situations where these powers had little to offer when Chad needed help the most. Perhaps it was time for Chad to become self-sufficient, to make decisions based on its own interests, rather than relying on the whims of foreign nations. One of the main catalysts for change was Chad's growing relationship with other African nations, particularly those in the Sahel region. These countries, many of which faced similar challenges, had begun to come together in recent years to discuss solutions to the instability that plagued the region. Countries like Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso had seen firsthand the destructive effects of terrorism and foreign intervention. Many of these nations felt that their sovereignty was being undermined by the presence of foreign powers. Chad was no exception. As Deby and his closest advisors examined the situation, they began to see an opportunity. What if Chad could lead a coalition of African nations that would work together to address the region's problems on their terms? What if Chad could stand as a symbol of African sovereignty, showing the world that the continent could solve its problems without being dependent on Western nations? The idea of African solutions to African problems began to resonate within the halls of power in N'Djamena. In the face of mounting criticism from the United States and the growing unrest at home, Deby started to move toward this vision of a more independent Chad. He reached out to his fellow leaders in the region, cautiously testing the waters for potential alliances. These alliances would not be based on foreign aid or military support, but on mutual respect and shared interests in promoting peace and stability in Africa. Slowly but surely, the discussions gained traction. Leaders from across the continent began to show interest in Chad's vision, and the groundwork was laid for a new kind of partnership that was centered on African cooperation. But as Deby continued to push forward with his plans, he knew that the United States would not take kindly to his shift in direction. The U.S. had invested too much in Chad's counterterrorism efforts to let the country slip away. The U.S. had built its military infrastructure in Chad for a reason, and if Chad were to distance itself from Washington, it would send a powerful message to the world. Chad was no longer going to be a pawn in someone else's game. It wasn't just a matter of political will. It was also a matter of survival. Chad's government had been under constant threat from armed rebel groups, many of which had received support from outside forces. The U.S. military had been instrumental in providing intelligence and resources to help Chad fight these insurgents. But with the growing internal unrest and the mounting pressure from the West, the government had to ask itself a difficult question. Was the relationship with the U.S. truly beneficial in the long term, or was it holding Chad back from charting its own course? It was a risky gamble, but one that had the potential to redefine Chad's future. By turning its back on the U.S. and forming new alliances within Africa, Chad could claim a greater sense of independence and self-determination. It would no longer be a small player on the world stage, caught between the demands of larger powers. Instead, it could become a leader in a new movement of African nations who were ready to take control of their own destinies. The United States, once seen as a close ally, would now be an obstacle to Chad's vision of a better future. As the weeks went by, the political situation in Chad became more fluid. Déby's plan was taking shape, but the risks were high. Moving away from the United States would mean breaking away from the security and resources that had been provided for so long. But it was also a chance to rewrite the narrative. If Chad could navigate this transition successfully, it could become a symbol of strength and independence for the African continent. At the same time, the world continued to watch. The U.S. had yet to fully understand the depths of the shift taking place in Chad, but when the announcement came, it would be impossible to ignore. The stage was set for a dramatic showdown that would send ripples throughout Africa and the world. The day that Chad made its bold move against the United States sent shockwaves across the globe. It wasn't just a political shift. It was a dramatic reassertion of Chad's independence, a powerful message that would make world leaders sit up and take notice. President Idris Déby and his advisors knew that once they made this move, there was no turning back. It was a decision that would change the course of the country's history and forever alter its relationship with the United States and the rest of the world. In the months leading up to the announcement, Chad's leadership had been laying the groundwork for what would be a seismic shift in its foreign policy. Behind closed doors, there were heated discussions about the future of Chad's relationship with the U.S. and the broader international community. While many of Chad's political leaders were eager to assert the country's sovereignty and reduce its dependence on foreign powers, others were hesitant. The risk was enormous. Turning away from the United States could lead to economic isolation, a loss of military support, and even political instability. But for some, the reward was worth the risk. It was time for Chad to stand on its own feet and not allow the shadow of foreign influence to loom over its future. As the decision was made, the government issued a statement to the world. It was a clear message. Chad was no longer going to tolerate foreign interference in its affairs, particularly from the United States. The government announced that it was withdrawing its cooperation with American military forces and intelligence agencies. U.S. military advisors, who had been stationed in Chad for years to assist in counterterrorism operations, were told to leave the country. The American presence, which had been so deeply embedded in Chad's military and security structures, was now being dismantled. The move was unexpected. Many outside the country had seen Chad as a reliable ally of the United States, especially in the fight against terrorism. The U.S. military had relied on Chad as a strategic base to conduct operations in the region, particularly against terrorist groups like Boko Haram and Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb. The loss of Chad as a partner in these efforts was a significant blow to U.S. counterterrorism operations in Africa. The announcement also made it clear that Chad was no longer willing to be a pawn in the larger geopolitical game being played by Western powers. Chad was taking control of its own destiny, and that was a message that would not be ignored. The global response was swift and varied. The United States, stunned by the move, quickly called for an emergency meeting of its national security team. Officials in Washington scrambled to figure out how to respond to Chad's actions. Some saw it as a betrayal, while others recognized that it was a sign of the changing dynamics in Africa. The U.S. government had long been the dominant power in the region, and Chad's decision was a reminder that smaller nations were increasingly unwilling to bow to external pressures. There was talk of imposing further sanctions on Chad, but many experts warned that such a move could backfire, further isolating the country and pushing it into the arms of other global powers. Meanwhile, in Africa, Chad's decision was seen as a bold step toward reclaiming sovereignty. Leaders from neighboring countries, some of whom had also been affected by Western intervention, expressed their support for Chad's decision. Countries like Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso, which had long struggled with foreign military presence and influence, saw Chad's move as an example of how African nations could take control of their own affairs. The sense of solidarity between African nations began to grow. Many felt that Chad's decision was the beginning of a new chapter in African politics, one in which the continent would no longer be at the mercy of outside powers. For the Chadian people, the announcement was met with a mixture of hope and uncertainty. The government had promised that this new direction would lead to greater economic independence and political freedom. But the reality of such a bold move was not without its challenges. Chad's economy was already fragile, and the loss of foreign aid and military support could push the country into a more precarious position. There were also concerns about the possible backlash from the United States and its allies. Would the West cut off economic ties with Chad? Would international organizations impose sanctions that could further cripple the country's economy? Despite these concerns, many citizens viewed the move as a necessary step toward reclaiming Chad's dignity and sovereignty. For too long, the country had been a pawn in the larger geopolitical games of foreign powers. Chad had been forced to accommodate the interests of its powerful partners, often at the expense of its own people. Now, with the decision to distance itself from the United States, there was a sense that Chad was finally taking control of its future. The decision also had a profound impact on the region. Chad's leadership had always been seen as a stabilizing force in Central Africa. The country had played a key role in helping to maintain peace in neighboring countries like Sudan, the Central African Republic, and Libya. But now, with Chad striking out on its own, there was a sense that the balance of power in the region was shifting. Some feared that Chad's move could destabilize the region, particularly if other nations followed suit. Others believed that it was a necessary step to break free from the influence of foreign powers and allow Africa to chart its own course. As the dust began to settle from the announcement, Chad's leadership began to focus on what would come next. The country's diplomats were working tirelessly to build new alliances, particularly with other African nations that were also wary of foreign interference. Chad sought to strengthen ties with regional organizations like the African Union and the Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS. It also reached out to countries in the Middle East and Asia, looking for new partnerships that would help boost its economy and security. In the meantime, the United States began to reassess its approach to Africa. The loss of Chad as a key partner in the fight against terrorism was a setback, but it also served as a wake-up call. The U.S. could no longer take its partnerships in Africa for granted. The decision by Chad was a reminder that African nations were increasingly asserting their independence and refusing to be dictated to by foreign powers. It was clear that the U.S. would have to find new ways to engage with the continent, respecting the sovereignty of African nations while continuing to work toward shared goals. As for Chad, the bold move against the United States had set the stage for a new chapter in its history. The country's leadership had shown that it was willing to take risks in order to secure a brighter future for its people. Whether that future would be one of peace and prosperity, or of struggle and isolation, remained to be seen. But one thing was certain: Chad was no longer a small, powerless nation at the mercy of foreign powers. It was now a force to be reckoned with, and the world would have to pay attention. When Chad made its bold move and distanced itself from the United States, the world was left stunned. The decision sent shockwaves through the global political landscape, and the consequences of this shift were felt far beyond the borders of Chad. What many had once viewed as a small, politically unstable country had suddenly become a focal point of international attention. The boldness of Chad's decision left the world questioning what this meant for global politics, and the response from other nations was swift and varied. The United States, caught off guard by the sudden shift, was forced to respond quickly. The loss of Chad as a key partner in the region, particularly in the fight against terrorism, was a major blow. The U.S. had invested considerable resources into Chad's military, providing training, intelligence, and financial aid to help the country battle extremist groups in the Sahel and beyond. The American military presence in Chad had also been a cornerstone of the U.S. strategy to counter the growing influence of radical groups in West and Central Africa. Losing that partnership was a serious setback in Washington's efforts to maintain stability in the region. In Washington, officials were scrambling to figure out how to respond. Some argued for taking a tough stance, calling for stronger sanctions and isolating Chad further. Others, however, suggested that this might be an opportunity to reassess U.S. policy in Africa and explore new ways to engage with the continent. Chad's move had revealed a growing shift in African politics, with many nations beginning to challenge the long-standing dominance of Western powers. For the United States, it was clear that the status quo in Africa was no longer sustainable. The loss of Chad was not just a blow to the U.S., it was also a wake-up call to other Western nations. European countries who had long been involved in military operations in Africa began to reassess their own relationships with African nations. The realization that smaller African countries were increasingly asserting their independence, as Chad had just done, began to sink in. Some European leaders expressed concern that if this trend continued, it could lead to a dramatic shift in the balance of power in Africa. Countries that had once relied on Western support for stability were now looking inward, seeking to solve their own problems without external interference. In Africa, Chad's bold move was seen as a turning point. Many African leaders who had long been frustrated by the influence of Western powers on their countries saw Chad's decision as a symbol of hope. The African Union, which had often struggled to assert its authority on the global stage, began to discuss how it could work together with Chad and other like-minded nations to reshape the continent's future. Leaders from neighboring countries, like Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso, who had all faced similar challenges with foreign intervention, expressed their support for Chad's decision. The idea of African solutions to African problems began to gain traction, as many saw it as the path forward for the continent. For these nations, Chad's bold move represented the beginning of a new chapter in African politics. No longer would African nations have to bow to the demands of Western powers. Instead, they could work together to address the continent's challenges on their own terms. This new spirit of unity and independence was infectious. Across the continent, people began to believe that Africa's future could be shaped by Africans, without the constant interference of foreign powers. But not everyone was so supportive of Chad's decision. Some African nations, particularly those that had long relied on Western aid and military support, were cautious about following Chad's lead. Countries like Kenya, South Africa, and Ethiopia, which had maintained close ties with Western nations, were uncertain about how this new direction would affect their own foreign policies. The fear of economic isolation and a loss of military support from the West weighed heavily on their leaders. The question of whether Chad's decision was a smart move or a risky gamble was being debated across the continent. At the same time, international organizations like the United Nations were also watching closely. Chad's move raised serious questions about the role of foreign intervention in Africa and whether it was time for African nations to take greater control of their own destinies. The UN, which had long been involved in peacekeeping and humanitarian efforts across the continent, began to discuss how it could support Chad's vision of a more independent Africa. There was growing recognition that the future of Africa needed to be shaped by Africans themselves, with international actors playing a supporting role rather than a leading one. In the midst of all this, Chad's government was working tirelessly to strengthen its new alliances. The country's diplomats were reaching out to other African nations, seeking to build a network of support that would help it weather the storm. The government also began to explore new relationships with countries outside of Africa, particularly in the Middle East and Asia. Chad's leadership understood that in order to succeed in this new, more independent world, it would need to diversify its alliances and build a broader base of support. Countries like China, Russia, and even Iran were seen as potential partners in Chad's bid to reduce its reliance on the West. As Chad's diplomatic efforts took shape, the world began to take notice. The boldness of Chad's decision, while controversial, had forced a re-evaluation of the role of foreign powers in Africa. It had sparked a debate about sovereignty, self-determination, and the future of global power dynamics. No longer could the United States or Europe take it for granted that African nations would follow their lead. Chad had shown that even the smallest nations could stand up to the might of the world's superpowers. The economic repercussions of Chad's decision were also beginning to unfold. The United States and its allies had been major contributors to Chad's economy, providing aid, trade, and investment. With the shift in foreign policy, there was uncertainty about what the future held for Chad's economy. Many feared that the loss of Western support would lead to a sharp decline in economic activity. However, some analysts believed that Chad's decision could open up new opportunities for economic growth by forging new alliances with other nations. Chad could diversify its trade partners and reduce its reliance on a single source of aid or investment. In Chad itself, the reaction to the move was mixed. While many citizens expressed pride in their country's newfound independence, there was also a sense of uncertainty. Chad's economy was fragile, and the loss of foreign aid could have serious consequences. The government reassured the population that it had a plan to navigate this transition, but the coming months would be critical. If Chad could successfully manage its new alliances and diversify its economy, it could emerge stronger than ever. However, if the transition proved too difficult, the country could face even greater challenges. The world watched as Chad's bold move unfolded, and the global repercussions continued to play out. While some saw it as a moment of hope for Africa, others viewed it as a risky gamble that could have unforeseen consequences. What was clear, however, was that Chad had set the stage for a new chapter in international relations. The country had dared to challenge the dominant powers of the world, and in doing so, it had forced a reevaluation of the way the world viewed Africa. Whether this would lead to a more independent, unified continent or to greater instability remained to be seen. As the months passed following Chad's bold move, the world found itself in a state of uncertainty. The decision to cut ties with the United States had not only shocked the global community, but also created a ripple effect that reached far beyond the borders of Chad. With the country charting a new course, the aftermath of this dramatic shift was still unfolding, leaving both allies and critics to reconsider their relationships with the small African nation. For Chad's leadership, the transition to a more independent future had proven to be both an exciting and challenging journey. The government had made it clear that their decision was about securing a better future for the people of Chad, one free from the influence of foreign powers. But the reality of this new direction came with its own set of obstacles. The country's economy, which had long been supported by foreign aid and military assistance, was now at a crossroads. With the withdrawal of American support, Chad had to find new sources of revenue and investment to ensure its continued development. Despite the uncertainty, the government remained resolute. Chad's leaders continued to push forward with their vision of a more self-sufficient and sovereign nation. The country's diplomats worked tirelessly to strengthen ties with African nations and other parts of the world that shared Chad's goals of reducing foreign dependence. As more African countries expressed solidarity with Chad's decision, the sense of unity within the continent began to grow. Leaders from nations such as Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso, which had long been dissatisfied with foreign intervention, joined Chad in advocating for a new era of African solutions to African problems. Chad's decision to break free from Western influence also had a lasting impact on the broader political landscape. Many experts began to argue that Chad's move signaled the end of an era in which African nations were seen as subordinate to global powers. This shift in power dynamics had not gone unnoticed by other countries around the world. While some viewed Chad's decision as a bold and inspiring step, others remained skeptical. Critics argued that Chad's newfound independence would come at a steep price, as the country's fragile economy and infrastructure would struggle without the support it had long relied upon. In Washington, the reaction was mixed. Initially, there had been shock and anger, as the United States had lost a key ally in the fight against terrorism in the Sahel region. The U.S. had poured resources into Chad, providing military training and assistance to help combat extremist groups operating in the region. But as the months went on, it became clear that the U.S. was no longer able to simply dictate the terms of its relationship with African nations. Chad's decision had forced Washington to rethink its approach to Africa. The United States, once the dominant force in the region, now faced a rapidly changing political landscape. For the U.S., the loss of Chad as a key partner raised uncomfortable questions about the effectiveness of its policies in Africa. Was it truly in the best interest of the continent to rely so heavily on foreign military presence? And could the United States maintain its influence in the region if African nations continued to distance themselves from Western powers? These questions, once unthinkable, were now at the forefront of discussions in Washington's corridors of power. The U.S. began to realize that it would have to adopt a more collaborative approach to its relationships with African nations, respecting their sovereignty and working together to address shared challenges. Despite the challenges, Chad's government remained committed to its vision of a more independent future. The country's leadership understood that this was a long-term project, one that would require patience, diplomacy, and hard work. They continued to reach out to new partners, forging alliances with countries outside of Africa. The Middle East, Asia, and even Russia began to emerge as potential sources of support. By diversifying its international relationships, Chad hoped to reduce its reliance on any single nation or bloc. This new strategy allowed Chad to spread its risks and increase its chances of success in an increasingly multipolar world. Meanwhile, inside Chad, the people's reaction to the changes was a mix of hope and concern. For many citizens, the decision to break away from Western influence represented a chance to reclaim their country's dignity. The frustration that had built up over years of inequality, corruption, and foreign domination was finally being addressed. The government's efforts to strengthen Chad's sovereignty and independence were seen as a sign of progress. People were hopeful that the country's resources, including oil and uranium, would now be used for the benefit of the Chadian people, rather than being exploited by foreign interests. However, the challenges were still significant. Chad's economy was heavily dependent on oil exports, and the price of oil had been volatile in recent years. With the loss of Western support, the country faced a difficult path to economic stability. The government had promised to invest in infrastructure, education, and healthcare, but the funding for these projects had to come from somewhere. It was clear that Chad would need to build its own industries, attract foreign investment, and create jobs for its growing population. But these efforts would take time, and the road to economic independence was bound to be long and difficult. As the world watched Chad's efforts unfold, there was a growing sense of curiosity about the country's future. Would Chad succeed in carving out a new role for itself on the world stage? Or would the challenges of economic isolation and political instability prove to be too much? The coming years would be critical in determining whether Chad's bold move had been a stroke of genius or a costly mistake. But there was no denying that Chad had already achieved something remarkable. The country had shown that it was possible for even the smallest nations to challenge the global order and assert their independence. The message from Chad was clear. Africa no longer needed to rely on foreign powers to solve its problems. The continent had the resources, the talent, and the will to forge its own path. In the aftermath of the bold move, many African nations began to rethink their own relationships with the West. Chad's decision had sparked a broader conversation about African sovereignty, self-determination, and the future of the continent. Countries that had long been under the influence of foreign powers were now considering how they could assert their own independence and build stronger regional alliances. For Chad, the road ahead was uncertain, but it was also filled with possibilities. The country had taken a daring step, and now it was up to its people and leaders to ensure that the vision of a more independent and prosperous future became a reality. The world was watching, and Chad's success or failure would have lasting implications for Africa's place in the global order.